Good morning, friends. Very good to see you all. I'm Father Michael, for those of you that I haven't met. Thank you for joining us this morning. There's a handout there on the table if you haven't got one, and there's coffee. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. O God, who by the light of the Holy Spirit did instruct the hearts of the faithful, grant us in the same Spirit to be truly wise and ever to rejoice in his consolation through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Louis Bertrand, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, welcome again. This is our fourth installment in this series we've been doing over the past year or two of Theology for the Laity, in order to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. St. Paul says to the Romans, "Do not conform yourself to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you might know what is holy and pleasing and perfect to God." So we've been seeking to understand what it is that we believe more deeply. Theology is faith, seeking understanding, taking what it is that we believe and seeking to understand it. And we've been seeking to do this through the help of the great teacher and theologian of the Church, St. Thomas Aquinas. So, just as a very brief review, we started in our first course considering Christian morality on the whole as the way to happiness. God has made us for himself, for perfect happiness, and the way to get to God is through good human acts, aided by grace, by the gift of the law, and by virtue. The law helps to teach us what is for our good. Grace, God's gift of grace, makes it possible for us to actually do the good. And virtue helps us to become habituated to the good, so that we can do this regularly, easily, joyfully, in a way that's second nature to us. So first we consider just that overall picture of the moral life as the way to the happiness that we're made for, our end, which is God. The highest good, perfect happiness. And then in the second course, and Father Bernard has placed these videos on the website, so if you want, you can always look at them. In the second course, we considered good and evil human actions. It's by human actions that we get to God. We're free beings, and so voluntary human acts, free human acts, either move us closer to God, further along our way, or away from God. They take us off the path that leads to God. So we considered good and human acts. If you remember, we considered the different parts of a human act and the ways that a human act can go right or wrong. What is done, the object of the act, the intention for which it's done, and then the relevant circumstances. All of those things have to be good for any human act to be morally good. Do the right thing for the right reason in the right and appropriate circumstances. If any one of those is bad, then that human act is bad as an act. So that was what we considered in the second course. And then last time, we considered the passions or the emotions and the moral life. Because emotions play a really big part in our lives as human beings, moving us, driving us, positively and negatively. So St. Thomas himself, in a very innovative way, in the 13th century, considered the emotions at great length in order to study how it is that at that level of our soul, the emotional level, we are either helped on our way to God or hindered. So that brings us to our present course, which is on the topic of sin and evil. This is not exactly the most inspiring material, but it's very important because, as I mentioned, the only way that we can get to God, get to our end, get to heaven, is by human acts. We're free creatures. We're not animals who simply act by instinct and have no free will. We can freely choose to embrace the good or to turn away from the good. And so it's important to consider, as St. Thomas does at some great length, to consider the different ways in which we do turn away from the good at times. As St. Paul says, all have sinned and are deprived of the glory of God. We're all in the same boat. St. John writes in his first letter, "The one who says he has no sin makes God a liar." All of us have fallen from God, and we continue in different ways, greater or hopefully lesser ways, to struggle with sin, with making good choices on our way to God. So it's helpful to consider this whole topic, but to consider it in a certain kind of way. There are different ways to consider sin and evil. Sometimes you see treatments of sin and evil that really just amount to a kind of list of what you can do and what you can't do, spelling out the rules, an approach to morality that is just about listing the rules and then doing them, and trying harder, doing better in order to follow the rules. But any realistic person knows that the moral life is not that simple. We can't just be told what to do and expect to be able to always do it. St. Paul writes about this. "I know the good that I ought to do, and yet I find myself doing the evil that I know I ought not to do." There is in the human soul a battle, a civil war at times between good and evil. I know the good I ought to do, and yet I find myself doing evil. It's a struggle at times for us fallen human beings. So it's not enough to simply be told what the commandments are and be expected to do them as if we could follow them by our own strength. If we could follow the commandments of the law with our own strength, then Christ died in vain. We didn't need to be saved from this condition wherein we can't save ourselves. So that's one approach, which is not at all St. Thomas's approach, just a kind of listing of rules and injunctions to follow them. Another approach that you sometimes see with regard to sin and evil is an approach that really focuses on the horror of different sins and the punishments that follow upon them as a way of inciting fear and aversion. If I fear this enough, I'll stay away from it. But again, the full reality of the Christian life, the moral life, can't be reduced to fear. St. John says that perfect love casts out all fear. The one who really lives in the love of God as a child of God is not meant to live motivated solely by fear. We're meant to live, as St. Paul says, in the glorious freedom of the children of God. Not simply in fear of hell, as real as hell is, and it is something to be feared. But that can't be the primary motivating force for our Christian life, because what ends up happening is we project this onto God. God becomes something fearful, and we're just trying to be good enough so that we don't end up separated from God. But the revelation of who God is so radically different. God is goodness itself. He is love. He draws us to himself by goodness, not by fear. So, St. Thomas has a very different approach to studying sin and evil. I think we could say it's a much more reasonable approach based on human reason. But it's an approach, really, I think, that's best likened to that of a surgeon or a physician. A surgeon, in order to do his job well, a surgeon has to understand the nature of many, many different kinds of maladies, diseases. He has to understand the full scope of maladies that the human person can suffer. He has to know what a healthy body is, how it operates, so he can understand the lack of health in that body. He can understand all the ways that health can go wrong. And then, when he understands the full scope of maladies, of diseases, then he can diagnose particular maladies in a particular person. This person comes to me and suffers in this particular way, and because all right. Because I understand the full nature of human maladies and diseases, then I can diagnose properly the particular problem that this person has versus that person. And if I diagnose the problem properly, then I can prescribe the correct remedy It's no use to prescribe a remedy to you for a problem that you don't have. So too in the moral life. Our individual struggles with sin and weakness are particular, and if we want to overcome sin and evil, which we of course do, we have to be able to diagnose the problem correctly, understanding full scope of sin and evil, and then understand the proper remedies. So St. Thomas's approach is really that like a physician or a surgeon. It's what we would call a scientific approach to the study of sin and evil. So that's what we're going to get introduced to, a kind of scientific study of what is the nature of evil and the nature of sin, the causes of sin, and then begin to consider the remedies, though that's a much larger discussion, and hopefully in preview of coming attractions, the great topics, the large topics that we've yet to consider and which follow from this then are the theological virtues and the cardinal virtues. These habits by which we are helped to be able to choose the good, to live for God at a supernatural level, theologically in faith, hope, and love, and then at a human level, in prudence and justice and fortitude and temperance. So hopefully we can consider those virtues in future classes, but for today and next week, we're going to undertake this kind of scientific study of evil and sin so that we have a fuller, more objective understanding of how it is that human beings can go astray in different ways and how to understand the different nature of different kinds of sin so as to open the path to the particular remedies for particular bad human actions. So today, we have two topics in our two lectures this morning. First, the nature of evil. Secondly, the nature of sin. And then next Saturday, we'll consider the causes of sin and then vice and remedies. All right, so we have a handout, particularly for this first lecture. I have to tell you, this material on evil is rather dense and complicated. I've given you a lot of quotes from St. Thomas. It'll probably raise a lot of questions, which is good. We'll have time for discussion. But we will dive in and do our best. So, what is evil? You have there on your handout a quote from St. Thomas's Summa. One opposite is known through the other, as darkness is known through light. Hence, also, what evil is must be known from the nature of good, the opposite of good. And what is good? Good is the perfection of a thing, according to its design. God designed everything good, and with a particular design. And when a particular thing, like an oak tree, reaches its perfection, all that it's meant to be, it's good. If something's lacking from it, there is an evil present. Therefore, it must be said that the name evil signifies the absence of good. That's the first idea. Evil signifies the absence of a good. And good, again, is simply the fulfillment of what God has made a thing to be, the perfection in the mind of the Creator, the design of the Creator. However, St. Thomas goes on there in the next quote, not every absence of good is evil. Okay, so we started saying that evil is the absence of a good, but now we need to be a little more precise, make a distinction. Not every absence of good is evil. An absence of good can be taken in two ways, in a privative sense and in a negative sense. This is what he means. Absence of good taken negatively is not evil. Otherwise, it would follow that what does not exist, what is not, is evil. For instance, a man would be evil if he did not have the swiftness of a deer, he says, or the strength of a lion. So, as a human being, I don't have the qualities that a lion has or a deer has. I lack the good that the lion has in his strength. But that's not evil because that doesn't belong to my nature to have the qualities of a lion. That's evil in a negative sense, something that I'm missing. However, he says the absence of a good taken in a privative sense, a privation, is evil because it's the lack of something that I am meant to have. And in this sense, he says the privation of sight, which is called blindness, is an evil. Okay, so evil is the lack of a good, the absence of a good, but not simply in the negative sense. Why? Because we're all finite creatures. We can't possess every good. It doesn't belong to us to have every good. But we are meant to have certain goods that are perfective of who we are. And if I am deprived, in this privative sense, of some good that I am meant to have, that is, in the most basic philosophical sense, the nature of evil. Now, this is not how we might typically think about evil, which is what we'll come to in a second. But first, keep in mind here that evil is the privation of a do-good. Do means it's proper to the thing. It belongs to the thing. I have eyes, we have eyes. It belongs to the organ of an eye to be able to see. If I can't see, I lack something that is meant to be there, a privation of a do-good. That's an evil, the absence of a good that I am meant to have. First, notice in this definition the primacy of the good. This is all about the good. The good always comes first. Good and evil are not two co-equal forces at war, trying to fight out to see who's going to gain the upper hand. This was a heresy in the early church, that good and evil there are two kind of gods, a good God and an evil God, and they're at war to see who will win. There is only one God, and God is goodness itself, and God is eternal. Goodness is eternal. Evil is not eternal. It's not co-equal with God. Evil is an absence of goodness. Goodness comes first. Evil enters the world, as we'll see, as something that takes away from goodness. So it's important, whenever we're talking about the difficult topic of sin and evil, to always keep in mind the primacy of the good. In the end, God always wins. Goodness always triumphs. Evil cannot finally triumph. God allows the possibility of evil for a time, as we'll consider, because he makes us free. But in the end, goodness always triumphs. The victory has already been won. All right, so we have this evil in the privative sense, the privation of a do-good, something that is meant to be there. This isn't the way that we typically think about evil. We typically think about evil in a moral sense. What we're talking about here, firstly, is simply an ontological sense, something that deals with reality. There are things that are lacking, that are meant to be, and that, philosophically, is the definition of evil. But now we can consider two different kinds of evil and arrive at that more intuitive sense in which we talk about evil, which is moral evil. So St. Thomas distinguishes here between two kinds of evil: a malum, that's simply the Latin word for evil, that's the broad term, and peccatum, which is sin. So you see there on your handout, a malum is any privation of something that's meant to be there. So a form, an order, a due measure, something that belongs to the nature of the thing, either in a subject, a person, or in an act. When something is missing, lacking, that is meant to be there, you have an evil. So blindness is the classic example. An eye is meant to see, and when it cannot see, when it's blind, you have an evil. All right. Now a peccatum, a sin, first of all, is an act. It's a human act. Sin, as we talked about a few times ago, we're always dealing with human acts here. Not simply, if you remember the distinction, an act of a human. There are things that happen in us that we have no voluntary control over. My heart pumps blood. I can't control that with my will. I can't tell my heart to stop pumping blood or to start pumping blood. And therefore, because I have no voluntary control over it, it can't be morally good or evil. It can be evil. I can have a bad heart that doesn't do what it's meant to do. But that's not a moral problem. Morality only enters into the picture when there is free will, when I'm voluntarily choosing to do or not to do. So a peccatum, a sin, is an act, a human act, that I have control over, I voluntarily commit, which lacks something that's meant to have, the ordering it's meant to have, the measure, the form. So Aquinas says that the category of evil is more comprehensive. It's larger than the category of sin. Sin is just one kind of evil. But every privation of a do-good is an evil of some sort. It's bad if my heart doesn't do what it's meant to do. That's a bad thing. It's not a morally evil thing, which means it doesn't hinder me from getting to God, but it's a problem. It doesn't function in the way that God created it to function, like the eye that doesn't see. So keep in mind these two distinctions. This is why in treating sin and evil, we're beginning with evil, because evil is the broader category. Sin is our ultimate concern, but evil is a big concern too, because as we will see, we all suffer evils in different ways, and this can be a great obstacle. The way in which we deal with suffering can be a great obstacle to God. So where does evil come from? All right, let's look at this long quotation here from St. Thomas. We, in a special way, divide the evil that is proper to rational creatures. So human beings are capable of evil in these two ways. He makes a division here. We divide evil that is proper to rational creatures into the evil of moral wrong. So this is sin. In Latin, it's malum culpae, literally the evil of fault, evil that you're guilty of. You might think of this most simply as evil that's committed. So that's the first category. Evil that is committed, evil that you are guilty of, which means there has to be a voluntary act, you're freely choosing it. So that's the first category. And evil of punishment, malum pene, the evil of punishment. Or you might think of this more simply as the evil suffered. So it's the difference between evil committed and evil that you suffer. We understand the distinction between these two kinds of evil in the following way. For we need to divide evil as we divide good, since evil is the contrary of good. Good signifies perfection. There are two kinds of perfection. One that consists in the forms and dispositions. So one kind of perfection deals with the nature of a thing. What makes an oak tree to be a good oak tree, a human being to function well as a human being. The other kind of perfection deals with activities, acts, human acts, what I freely choose to do. So one thing deals with what I am, my nature, how I'm designed. One deals with acts that I freely choose. So there are two kinds of evil, insofar as the cause is either some kind of privation of form, disposition, something that I'm meant to have that I don't have, or a deficiency in an act itself. In an intellectual creature, which we are, it is clear that disordered acts of the will, sins, have the character of moral wrong, since one is blamed and rendered culpable for voluntarily engaging in disordered acts. But also, intellectual creatures suffer evil that they didn't choose when they're deprived of anything that's necessary for good activity. And such evil, this is an important point and a subtle, a difficult point to grasp fully. This second category of evil, evil that is suffered, the evils that we suffer, if you have, a disease, such evil in the judgment of the Catholic faith needs to be called punishment. Punishment, okay. We'll talk about what this means here. So we have these two categories, evil committed, sin, and evils that we suffer that aren't of our making, of our fault directly. How did evil enter the world? Evil entered the world through sin. Firstly, the sin of Lucifer and the fallen angels in choosing to disobey God through a free act, and then the sin of our first parents in likewise choosing to disobey God. Evil enters the world through an act. Malum culpae comes first, the evil that one is guilty for. That's how evil entered the world. But as a result of sin, as a result of the first sin, the first human sin, punishment for sin entered the world. As a result of violating God's order of creation, of voluntarily acting against his design and command, there is punishment. So St. Thomas says that death and all defects of the present life are punishment for original sin, for that first sin. All of the things that we suffer, all of the ways that say, the body, physically, emotionally, psychologically, all the ways that it can go wrong, have different defects. These are maladies, things that were not meant to be part of the original design. God didn't create illness, sickness, disease. All of these things, theologically speaking, are punishments, evils that enter the world as punishment because of the first sin. Now, punishment here should not be understood as a kind of juridical decision. God is a judge, and he just kind of arbitrarily applies these punishments to different people as a kind of extrinsic imposition. Don't think of punishment here as something kind of coming from God, as someone who's sitting on a throne and just handing out punishments. Instead, it's better to consider that what a punishment is, the punishment for sin, is the natural consequence of violating God's order. God established an order for all things. It's the plan in his mind for all of creation. When that order is violated by sin, there are natural consequences, things that follow from the violation of that order. So all things come from God. Nothing could possibly be without being created by God and being created good. But all things are created according to God's own mind, his design. God has inscribed within each thing the plan for its perfection. And when that plan is acted against, when the design, the order of God is acted against, there are redounding effects, consequences. So, death and all defects in the present life are punishment for original sin. All the evils that we suffer, that second category, enter into human existence because of sin, as part of the fallout from sin. So we need to consider next original sin. This is where all of this begins. The whole problem of sin and evil begins with our first parents. So the next quote on your handout under original sin, this is from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Through one person, sin entered the world, through our first parent. And through sin, see what he says here, through sin, because of sin, then death. And thus death came to all, inasmuch as all sinned. For if by the transgression of one person death came to reign through that one, how much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of justification come to reign in life through the one person, Jesus Christ? In conclusion, just as through one transgression, the first sin, condemnation came upon all, so through one righteous act, acquittal and life came to all, the act of Christ saving us. So you have Adam and his sin, and Christ, the new Adam, his obedience to the Father brings life to all. For just as through the obedience of one person the many all were made sinners, so through the obedience of one, Christ, the many will be made righteous. Now, we have to note here that original sin, this whole doctrine of original sin, is a matter of faith. This is something we could have never come to understand simply by our own human minds. We know this reality because it has been revealed to us, and St. Paul's letter to the Romans is one of the places where this truth of the faith has been revealed. So original sin it's a difficult topic to fully grasp theologically, but we have to first start by recognizing that it's a matter of faith. It's not something that we can fully reason to. But, as you see in the next quotation, according to the Catholic faith, we are bound to hold that the first sin of the first man is transmitted to all his descendants by way of origin. Okay, this is what original sin is all about, that the sin of Adam, and just to make a little precision, original sin is not the same thing as the first sin. The first sin is the actual act of disobedience of our first parents. Original sin is a condition that follows upon the first sin which everyone who shares human nature participates in, partakes of. Because the first sin corrupted human nature itself, what it is to be human. We've talked in the past about common human nature. It means there's a certain essence, a certain thing that is human that we all share. It's individualized, particularized in us, but we all are human. We all have a rational soul joined to a certain kind of animal body. That human nature itself was wounded, corrupted by the first sin. So significant was this first break from God that human nature suffered. And so everyone who has human nature, everyone who is a son or daughter of Adam and Eve, receives a corrupted nature, a human nature that's not fully intact. This is the condition of original sin. So original sin is a habit. Original sin is not an actual sin. The first sin is the sin. Original sin is a habit in the essence of the soul. It's an inordinate disposition, a disposition to something that's out of order, disordered, which arises from a certain destruction of harmony within us. There was, in man's original state, a perfect harmony within all of creation, but especially within man's soul. That harmony is lost. We'll describe the different layers of that harmony in a moment, but that harmony is lost after the first sin. And so we live with this lack of harmony, this habit. St. Thomas likens it to a bodily sickness. It's as if our soul is sick in a way. He calls original sin the sickness of nature. When you have a serious sickness in your body, things are out of harmony. They're not working together as they're meant to. So too in the human soul. There's a lack of equilibrium, which is essential to health. So original sin affects all the different parts of the soul. And if you remember, we've talked about the powers of the soul, the intellect, our highest power, the power to know the truth, the will, the power to choose the good, and then we have the emotions, the passions. We have the irascible passions, which are the emotions that arise in the presence of a difficult matter, something arduous. So the emotions of hope or despair, the emotions of daring or fear, the emotion of anger. These are irascible emotions, and then the concupiscible emotions, which simply arise in the presence of some good or evil thing. So when I see something good, I love it, I desire it, I find pleasure in it when I possess it, or when I see something evil, I hate it, I have an aversion to it, or I have sorrow if it's present to me. These are the powers of the human soul. It's these powers that make us to be like God, in God's image. These powers are a sharing in God's own soul, God who is perfect knowing and perfect loving. It's by the intellect that we have the power to know the truth and to love, to choose the good. These powers are part of our animal nature. We have these powers because we have bodies, and with our bodies we react in different ways to goods and evil. The point about original sin, this sickness of nature, is that every one of these powers of the soul is wounded in different ways as a result of original sin. So the intellect suffers the wound of ignorance. Now, as a side note, it's really important to say here that when we're talking about the wounds of original sin, there's an important distinction between saying that a power is wounded and saying that the power is destroyed. Sin does not destroy nature. It doesn't destroy these powers such that they could never operate again. It wounds them. They're not perfectly intact. It's a sickness, but not a destruction. This is a really important dividing line in theology. There are certain Protestant theologies, Martin Luther veers in this direction. They really believe that sin destroys the soul in an irreparable way. We need to hold very strongly to the fact that because evil is not a co-equal power to good, evil cannot destroy the fundamental good of our creation, the fundamental design that God created. Evil cannot destroy these powers. It can wound them, make it difficult for them to operate well, but it doesn't destroy them. We'll talk more about that. But here we're talking about wounds. So we have an intellect capable of knowing the truth, and yet we suffer from ignorance, so that it's difficult at times to know the truth. And we should also note that while these wounds come from original sin, all of these wounds are tragically exacerbated in us by our own actual sins. When we sin of our own volition, we compound these wounds in our soul, or particular wounds depending on the particular kind of sin. So with the intellect, I already have a kind of darkness, some degree of darkness in my mind. I don't see the truth clearly, perfectly. But if I continue to personally sin with my intellect, to give myself over to falsehood, to deny the truth, well, I compound that darkness in my mind, making it even more difficult, wounding the power even more. The will suffers the wound of malice. The will is meant for the good. By the wound of malice, we're inclined to choose evil and not good, to choose something because it's contrary to the good. Think of, a case of a really, really malicious act, a malicious person who wants evil. Now, he wants it because it appears good to him. We can only choose something because it appears good, but who's really set on something evil. That's a different kind of moral problem than ignorance, or with the irascible passions, we have the wound of weakness. So in the face of difficult, arduous things, I suffer a kind of weakness. Instead of pushing forward in hope, I pull back in cowardice because of the wound of weakness. And with concupiscible passions, our basic desires in the face of good and evil things, we have the wound of concupiscence, which is a inordinate desire, a disordered desire to choose delectable things against the measure of reason, something that's not reasonable. All of these wounds that follow from original sin come to human nature because of what is called original justice. Original justice is the state that the first human beings were created in. Justice means that things are rightly ordered. None of this existed in our first parents. Everything was rightly ordered. So the lowest powers of the soul were subordinated rightly to the highest power. The intellect is the highest power. It was able to direct the will. The will was able to govern the passions, and man's intellect was rightly subordinated to God's mind. Man knew the truth because he was rightly ordered to God. This is all in the soul. Then the body, the human body, is rightly subjugated to the soul. So there is in the original creation this perfect ordering, harmony, which St. Thomas calls original justice. Everything is rightly ordered in all of creation to God. As a result of the first sin, original justice is destroyed. That gift, original justice, was a gift of grace. Original justice was wiped out as a result of the first sin, which is why these wounds enter in. Man is no longer perfectly in harmony with God, with himself, the body, to the soul, and the rest of creation. So we have this disharmony in different ways that enters into the human condition, and then other punishments that follow. All other defects, when the body is not fully subjected to the soul, it opens the door to the possibility of all kinds of sufferings and evils that were not meant to be part of the original human condition, when everything was rightly ordered to the Creator. But when that order was violated, all kinds of consequences follow, including punishments, different evils that are suffered. All right, so let's consider now the state of what is called corrupt human nature. So we said that because of the first sin, human nature itself is wounded, and this is called the state of corrupted human nature. Human nature is not destroyed, but it is corrupted. And this is the human nature that you and I, every human being, has as our essence, a human nature that's not perfect. It is human nature. We all have a rational soul, and a certain animal body, but it's not perfect. It's important here to distinguish three things. First, the constitutive nature of man, what it means to be human, with the necessary powers of the soul, for example, that we just looked at, to have an intellect, a will, the passions. Then we have inclinations. From those powers of the soul, we're inclined, we're moved to certain things. And then third, we have the gift of original justice. So in man's original state, he's designed in a certain way, has a certain nature, certain powers. From those powers of the soul, inclinations flow, moving us to acts that will perfect those powers. So the inclination to know the truth. You and I have a natural inclination to know the truth. Why? Because we have a power, the intellect, that's made for the truth. The inclination follows from that. So let's consider, in the state of corrupted human nature, what happens to these three levels. Very importantly, as we mentioned already, the constitutive nature of man, what it means to be human, is not affected by sin in any way. The original sin and any other sin cannot affect this in any way. Otherwise, we'd no longer be human. If sin could destroy our nature, our powers, then we wouldn't be human beings. We wouldn't have that nature anymore. So original sin does not affect these powers at all. The powers, that means the fact that we have the powers, the fact that I have an intellect and a will. Now, the actual operation of those powers is another matter. But to have the powers, you can't be a human being without having an intellect and a will and everything else. It's part of our body, for example. But then there are inclinations in the soul. I have an intellect, and so I have an inclination to know the truth. Inclinations, which flow from these powers, are diminished by sin. Not destroyed, but diminished. So that we're not as strongly inclined, as well inclined to the fulfillment of our nature as we would be in a state of perfect integrity. My inclination to know the truth or to do the good is present, but it's not in its full state. It's diminished. And then we talked about original justice, the way in which everything was held in perfect harmony. This is destroyed. Why? Because this was a gift from God. This was not part of our nature. Original justice is a gift of God's grace. And when man sinned against God, he cut himself off from God in an absolute way. And therefore, that harmony which flowed from man's relationship with God was lost. And so there are those wounds that enter. Things are not in perfect harmony. So this is what corrupt human nature looks like. We're still human. The basic constitution of what it means to be human doesn't change, but we're less inclined to the goods that we're made for, and we don't have this perfect harmony, body and soul, and within the soul, that did exist in the state of original nature. So, what is the solution? We have to start with what is most essential. What is the one sacrament that is necessary for salvation? Only one sacrament is necessary for salvation. Baptism. Baptism is the sacrament necessary for salvation because by baptism, the guilt of original sin is removed. So not only does original sin mean that we suffer in different ways in our own nature, we suffer punishments, we also suffer the guilt of Adam's sin, which is a difficult thing to understand entirely. But as we saw in that passage from Romans, one man sinned and all are made sinners in that one man. We all suffer the guilt. We are all born with the guilt of original sin. Baptism removes the guilt, but not the punishments. So remember these two categories of evil. Evil of guilt, malum culpae, evil that one is guilty of, sin, and evil of punishment, evil that is suffered. Baptism is the sacrament that removes the guilt so that we can be brought back into relationship with God. Without baptism, there is no salvation. But baptism doesn't remove all of these punishments, the evils that we suffer. Now, the next quote on your handout is a kind of speculation from St. Thomas as to why this is the case. Why doesn't baptism remove all of these punishments that we suffer, the evils that we suffer? This is what St. Thomas would call an argument from fittingness, meaning it hasn't been revealed to us exactly why, but we can reason theologically as to why it's fitting. So this is what he says. Baptism has the power. Baptism is so powerful that it has the power to remove all of the penalties, the punishments that we suffer in the present life, and yet it does not take them away during the present life. But, notice this is interesting, by the power of baptism, all of these punishments and penalties will be taken away in heaven. So in heaven, as we know, there will be no more suffering, there will be no more lack in any way, and that perfect integrity that we will have in heaven, St. Thomas says, will be the effect of baptism coming to its full consummation. But God has ordained that that full effect of baptism does not happen here and now in the present life, and St. Thomas makes here three arguments of fittingness. This is reasonable for three reasons. First, because by baptism, man is incorporated into Christ. He's made a member of the body of Christ. Consequently, this is the argument here, it's fitting that what takes place in the head, in Christ, should take place also in the member of the body. Now, from the very beginning of his conception, Christ was full of grace and truth, yet he had a passible body. Passible means capable of suffering. Christ took on a body, a human body that was capable of suffering, which through his passion and death was raised up to a life of glory. Wherefore, a Christian receives grace in baptism as to his soul, but he retains a passible body, a body capable of suffering, so that he may suffer for Christ. Why is it reasonable that suffering is not taken away? Firstly, so that we are able to suffer for Christ and with Christ, to become more like Christ, who suffered for us. There is, in a mysterious way, a tremendous privilege in being able to suffer with Christ, to be joined to Christ's cross. So seeing suffering, all the sufferings that we endure, sufferings that our loved ones endure, firstly, as a means, an instrument by which we can be conformed to Christ. As St. Paul says, by which we can fill up even what's lacking in the suffering of Christ, meaning that we can continue to join our suffering willingly to his so that God's work of salvation can continue to play out to further and further members of the body. So that's the first reason, that we might suffer with him so as to be glorified with him. Unless you die with him, you will not rise with him. So the penalties, the punishments of sin, which are all the evils that we suffer, aren't taken away in this life. They are taken away in heaven. They're not taken away in this life, firstly, so that we can suffer with Christ. The cross is the way to glory, and it's the only way. It's not the way we would have chosen, but in God's perfect wisdom, it is the perfect plan for our salvation. And so there is a certain privilege, not to undermine in any way the very real evil of suffering. It is a kind of evil. But there is a certain privilege of being able to accept suffering that we cannot avoid and be united to Christ in it, to suffer with him and so be glorified with him. The second reason, he says, is that this is suitable for our spiritual training, in order that by fighting, having to struggle against concupiscence and other defects to which we're subject now in this corrupt state, we may receive the crown of victory. Therefore, a gloss says on Romans that the body of sin may be destroyed. If a man after baptism live in the flesh, he has concupiscence to fight against and to conquer by God's help. So God doesn't leave us alone in the battle. He gives us the grace to help us. But there is virtue and merit in battling against disordered inclinations, against wounds that lead us to sin, that incline us to sin in different ways. There is grace and merit in having to struggle and battle and choose the good and be trained in it. Because we are creatures who live in time, we're continually on this path, this journey, and so there's a fittingness in having to keep working, keep moving forward, keep cooperating with God's grace to choose the good and thus become more and more merit more and more victory. Thirdly, interestingly, St. Thomas, who's always very reasonable, he says that it's suitable that grace of baptism shouldn't take away all of the suffering and penalties of the present life, lest some men might seek baptism only so that these sufferings may be taken away in the present life and not for the sake of God. Imagine if the grace of baptism took away every suffering, every punishment. Well, it could be very tempting to seek baptism in order to receive that gift without in any way seeking to live as a child of God. We seek baptism in order to belong to God, to be made his children, to live in friendship with him, and ultimately to live with him forever. The goal is not here and now. The Christian life is not about life in this world, ultimately. We are pilgrims, exiles, the scriptures say, on our way to our eternal homeland. And so the one who wants the reward only here and now misses everything, misses out on the whole point. And so Aquinas says it's reasonable that baptism shouldn't give us every grace here and now, lest we lose sight of where we are actually going. All right, so that's what baptism does. Baptism takes away the guilt of original sin so that we can be made children of God, friends of God. But we still have to suffer the effects of original sin, the punishments, the natural consequences of living in a world where the order of God was violated in such a profound way, and where it continues to be violated in every actual sin that we commit or that others commit, which have their consequences that affect others as well. Now, the last question we need to consider here before we break for some question and answer is the question of God and evil. This is a very difficult question, but there's a basic distinction we need to make. Does God cause evil? Notice, this is not the same question as, does God cause sin? So keep in mind the distinction between evil and sin. Evil is any privation of a do-good. Sin is a human act that is deprived of its proper order. Does God cause sin? Absolutely not. In no way whatsoever. Directly or indirectly does God cause sin. Sin is a voluntary act that goes directly against God, against his goodness. God cannot cause or will something that is contrary to his nature. It's a kind of schizophrenic reality. God, who is perfectly one, cannot cause something that's directly contrary to himself. God does not cause sin in any way whatsoever. God has created us as free, so we have the capacity. If we are truly free, we have the capacity to choose good or to not choose good. But giving us that capacity doesn't mean that God causes us to choose sin. So God does not cause sin, but God does cause evil in one sense. God does cause the evils of punishment. The evils that we suffer, evils of punishment, are caused by God. So look at this last quote here in your handout from St. Thomas. God in no way wills the evil of sin, malum culpae, which is the privation of right order towards the divine good. The evil of natural defect, that's another category we haven't talked about, which we can come back to, but it's really about the animal world. The evil of natural defect or of punishment, which is what we're talking about, the evil of punishment, malum pene, God does will by willing the good to which such evils are attached. Thus, in willing his own justice, God wills punishment. Justice is a good, that all things be rightly ordered. God wills justice. And in willing the good of his justice, he does, at the same time, will punishment, that there be punishment for violations of his justice. And in willing the preservation of the natural order, he wills that some things be naturally corrupted in the animal world. The point here is that punishment is not contrary to God's goodness, which can be difficult for us to understand, because when we receive punishment, it is contrary to our goodness in some sense. When we suffer in different ways as punishment for sin, that is something that's contrary to my good. It's something that I experience as an evil. It's an evil of punishment. But punishment is not contrary to God's goodness, because God, who orders all things rightly by justice, rightly metes out punishment when there are violations of that justice. It's good that injustice be punished. Imagine if we lived in a world, and ultimately in an eternity, where injustice had no punishment, where the most heinous of sins never had any consequence. Immediately we can see how insufficient that would be, how completely, how something would be completely lacking if there was no punishment for sin. Punishment is a good for God, in that it sets things right. Firstly, there is a satisfaction that comes. Some satisfaction is made from punishment. But also because God is supremely good, God's punishments, the evils that we suffer because sin exists, and in consequence of our own sin in some way, the evils that we suffer are also medicinal. They're remedial. They're evils that are meant to help turn us around, get us back on the right path. God doesn't destroy us, which he could justly do. God's justice is merciful. If he were to give us the full punishment we deserved, we would be annihilated. St. Thomas says that even in hell, the depths of hell, God's mercy reigns, because the deepest levels of hell, whereas there are those guilty of the deepest evils, what they truly deserve is to be wiped out, obliterated. But God sustains them in being, which is a gift. God continues to hold them in existence. They're punished, they're eternally separated from him, but the very fact that they exist is merciful in a way. So to keep in mind that God's punishments, the evils that we suffer, are meant to be medicinal. They're meant to help us understand more clearly what it is that we've been made for and how it is that we find our way back to God. There's a line in the liturgy that says that God wounds us as he heals. God's ultimate work of salvation is meant to heal us, but part of the way that God heals us is by wounding us. Think about the image, an image that was very common in the early church. The fathers of the church spoke of God as the divine physician. God diagnoses the maladies in our souls, and if we use the image of a human disease, God has to remove those. So he has to take his scalpel and cut deep. He has to wound, like the physician has to wound in order to heal. But God, the perfect physician, knows exactly what has to be cut out and how to wound us in such a way that it will ultimately redound to our healing. So there is suffering in the world that exists because of sin. Now, we want to make one last note here, and a very important theological note, that the things that you and I suffer are not, in any absolute way, directly corresponding to our sins. So, remember when Jesus and his apostles come across the man born blind, in the 9th chapter of John's Gospel, and his apostles say, "Master, Rabbi, is this man blind because of his sin or because of his parents' sin?" And Jesus says, "Neither he nor his parents sinned. It is so that the works of God might be made visible through him." So we cannot say that there's a direct correspondence between my sin and, say, I get cancer. Well, I have cancer because I committed this sin. No. There is no absolute correspondence between particular human sin and particular human sufferings. Ultimately, suffering exists because sin destroyed this ordering with God. That's what we might call the general explanation for why human suffering exists. The particular question, why does this person suffer this particular evil, is something that we cannot answer. Something that God has not revealed. It's something that in some way is within the mind of God, and perhaps we will see the answer to those particular questions when we see God face to face, but we can't know. What we can know is that there's not an absolute correspondence between the evils I suffer and my own sin. But at the same time, we have to recognize that our own sins, our own personal sins, do have consequences and punishments, and we do suffer those as well. But not everything that I suffer is necessarily the consequence of some sin of mine or my parents, etc. Lastly here, there's also something about the mystery of the cross revealed by Christ. Christ said to his disciples when they confronted the blind man that it was so that the works of God might be made manifest through his suffering. Remember what St. Paul says. 3 times he begged the Lord that the thorn in his flesh might be removed. Whatever this suffering was, he begged the Lord that it might be removed. And the Lord said to him, "No, I will not remove it. My grace is sufficient for you, and my power will be made perfect in your weakness, in your suffering." This is part of God's plan, that we are to be made perfect in what it is that God allows us to suffer. God gives us the grace to suffer with him, to carry the cross with him. He does remove some sufferings, but not all. And we should ask, as Paul asked, that suffering be removed. But when the answer is no, the answer is ultimately, I will make it possible for you to carry this cross with me and for you to be made perfect with me in and through your suffering. St. Paul came to know this truth deeply. And so he writes at length about this in 2 Corinthians, "I boast gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may be alive in me. Therefore," he says, "I am content with weakness, with suffering, with insults, with hardships, with persecutions, for the sake of Christ. Because when I am weak, then I am strong in him whose power is alive within me." All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, starting with the question of what evil is. Evil is a privation of a do-good, something that ought to be there. But the really important distinction is between evils that we commit and evils that we suffer. Evils that we commit are voluntary acts, sin. Evils that we suffer are ultimately, in the grand scheme in God's mind, they are punishments that enter the world because of sin. So in the next lecture, we're going to focus then on sin, but questions about evil.
Hey, Father, you mentioned about, don't mean to put you on the spot here, but the Father Trigilio of EWTN several years ago said something similar about somebody in hell is being given mercy.
Yes.
And you said this about the same thing. I told my mom, God bless her soul, about that, but she said that can't be right because in Scripture it says that when Judas betrayed Jesus, that it would be better for that person never to be born. Mm-hmm. So can you just go ahead and expand on that?
Sure. So when we talk about goodness, we want to distinguish between a fundamental kind of goodness that St. Thomas would call ontological goodness and moral goodness. Okay, ontological goodness means that it's good that we exist. Ontological is the adjective having to do with being. The very fact that we exist, that we have being, is a good. Why? Because we don't exist of ourselves. We didn't cause ourselves to exist. We only exist because God brought us into being. And everything that exists, from the smallest ant to you and I and the highest angels, we exist by participating in God, who is being itself. So the fact that anything exists is good, and it only exists because God continues to will for it to exist. So the only way in which there is goodness in the demons and in those who are damned is this ontological goodness. The fact that they exist is a good. God continues to extend to them the gift of existence, that apart from him and his willing it, they could not exist. So there's no moral goodness in them whatsoever. But it is good insofar as a being participates in God in the gift of existence. There is goodness in this kind of philosophical level, basic philosophical level. So the point that St. Thomas makes is that God could have, in his justice, not given them that gift of existence anymore. He could have relinquished that, such that they would simply be annihilated. They would have no being. The demons and those who are damned will exist for all eternity, as every rational soul will exist for all eternity. And they only exist because God continues to will. He continues to give them a participation in his being, which in some way is an act of goodness on God's part. It's not the full penalty that they deserve.
Okay, so
Another
you're
question?
thinking maybe, I'm still a little bit confused about
Okay, we'll talk about it at the break, but let's see if there are other questions.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Good. Yes, sir.
So Adam was created
Yes,
in perfection,
that's right.
and sin, through him, sin created imperfection.
Yes.
Was Adam designed on earth to live forever? What's the difference
a good
between that
question.
and heaven?
It's a good question. Yeah, it's a very good question. So it doesn't belong to human nature to live forever. Why? Because our body is made of a material substance that naturally decays over time. But Adam and Eve, our first parents, were given by God additional gifts. One of the gifts was original justice, but they were also given gifts with regard to their body. One of the gifts they were given was called impassibility, which means that the body was held together such that it wouldn't decay. That gift was also lost with sin, which is why Paul says that death entered the world. But death here again is a natural consequence of our body being left to itself. Without the gift of God holding us together, the body will naturally decay over time. So what's the difference between paradise, the earthly paradise that Adam and Eve lived in, and heaven? The difference is the degree of their union with God. So on earth, there is a separation between God and man, a distinction. Now, Genesis says that they lived in friendship with God. They walked together in the garden, which perhaps is a matter of imagery, but they lived in a profound friendship with God. But friendship is not the same thing as complete union. Heaven, which is what they were destined for, why are we destined for heaven? Because of those two powers that make us to be in God's image, the intellect and the will. God made us like himself by giving us an intellect and a will, the power to know and the power to love. But those powers, because their participation in God's own knowing and loving, have infinite dimensions. I mean, you're not satisfied when you come to know, okay, I've come to know, this whole finite body of material. Well, you still want to know more. You still want more love. We're made for infinite knowledge and love, which God is. He made us like that, which is what St. Augustine says. You have made us for yourself, for a union of knowing and loving, and therefore our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So Adam and Eve enjoyed a relationship of friendship, of knowing and loving with God in paradise, but the eternity that we're made for is the complete, infinite relationship of knowing and loving, that we'll be drawn into God's own Trinitarian life. God is an infinite relation of perfect knowing and loving. And heaven, by God's incredible grace, means that we are elevated to the point where we can be perfectly known and we can know God perfectly and perfectly loved and love God perfectly, enter into that Trinitarian life. Now, the tremendous difficulty, question, puzzle, and mystery is how Adam and Eve, in this state of such integrity and friendship, could have sinned, how they could have turned away from God. It's something that's absolutely irrational. As St. Thomas says, all sin, finally, is irrational. It makes no sense. It shows something of the weakness of our nature, but even, the greater mysteries in the angels who are so far above us in the order of being, whose minds, whose intellects are so much greater than ours. How could Lucifer have turned away from God freely? It's an absolutely irrational thing that no final, reasonable explanation can be given for. Yes?
Oh man, I don't know how to ask this. I'm thinking about what you mentioned, that we suffer things that are not necessarily direct consequence of our own particular sin.
Yes.
Knowing that we're made in God's image and likeness, right? I suppose that the entire human race is really meant to live in union.
Yes.
Just like God, Trinitarian, lives in union within the Trinity, right?
Yes.
So in that sense, we take it for the team.
Yes.
Does that
Yes.
sound right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
We take it for the team.
St.
We don't
Paul's-
know who from the team, someone
That's right.
else far
Yes.
away,
And this is
Or
an
take it from
important
the team.
theological point, about St. Paul's theology of the body of Christ, that we can suffer for the good of others, that we can willingly embrace the suffering that God allows, or some saints, and I wouldn't recommend this, but some saints willingly ask God to give them greater suffering. You really have to know what you're doing, because you might unwittingly be asking for much more than you can handle. Not that God would give you more than you can handle, but it is the case that yes, that we can suffer for the sake of others, for the good of others in the body. That when one member of the body suffers, all suffer, but one member of the body can also suffer for others. I mean, you know this in human relationships, how parents suffer for their children, and willingly embrace certain sufferings for the good. Yes.
Right. So you're saying, so in some ways, we suffer for the team. For somebody else who made a mistake, didn't kick the goal into the, inside of the goal, or missed a shot, what it is. So somewhere else, we suffer for the team. But how does that, I suppose we all know, I don't know how to ask this. I guess maybe can you expound a little bit more on that, on this entire human race unity that we're meant to live?
Sure. We probably want to say first and foremost that a human soul, can only be saved by freely accepting the gift of God, friendship with God, God's grace. I can't do that for anyone else. No one else can do that for me. The only way that I can be saved is if I make my yes to God, which, can happen in different ways. So that is to say that suffering for the sake of others, on behalf of others, isn't something that can save a person's soul in an absolute way if it's contrary to the will of that person. It's something that God can use in his economy to help dispose that person, to help move that person, to help open the soul, but it can't move their will. No one can move my will. No one can move your will. Only I can say yes and accept Christ. Does that help? But there's mystery in how, it's like intercessory prayer, how all of this can have an effect. Not an absolute, determinative, final effect, but it can be a real source of grace and help. Any other questions?
When you
Yes.
look at something like an addiction,
Yes.
like an addiction to gambling,
Yes.
some people can gamble and they don't have a problem. Other people can gamble and have a little bit of problem. Other people can gamble and it can destroy their life and the life of their families.
Mm-hmm.
So the amount of evil that is allowed to enter into the person who has the really bad gambling problem, how can you look at what kind of portals or what kind of different variations of that person's, privation of grace allows them to get to that level?
Yeah. It's a good question, a difficult question. We'll talk about this a bit in the next talk, but in something complicated, like an addiction, especially when we're talking about culpability, to what degree is a person culpable, not only for their bad human acts, their sins, but for an addictive pattern of behavior? No addiction comes about except at some level through repeated actions. Addiction is a kind of habit. Habits come about through repeated actions. But that's not the only thing involved necessarily, because the powers of the soul are wounded in different ways. And St. Thomas describes how in different persons this can play out differently. Different people can have different disordered inclinations. So a person could be born with a kind of disposition to a certain weakness, a certain kind of disordered act. Now, a disposition does not in any way necessitate act. If I'm born, say, with a disposition to alcoholism, which can also have biological causes, as well. But if I'm born with that, that doesn't mean that because I have the disposition, I, of necessity, act. It means it will be more difficult, probably, for me to act well. And so you can have involved here in a case of addiction certain dispositions, disordered dispositions that a person suffers that are not of their making, which make it more difficult. Therefore, the whole question of culpability ultimately, is only something God can adjudicate. God knows the soul. He knows the degree to which their free will was caught up in this, the degree to which this is a sin of weakness versus a sin that's something much more willed and intentional. But in any addiction, there is repeated human action, which to some degree, probably, the person is going to be culpable for, but that degree of culpability could span a wide range. That's not only about free choice, but also the condition of the person. Maybe this man versus this man has a lot more to fight against, as it were, a lot more disordered disposition in this regard that he has to battle against, so it's a much more difficult battle for this man, such that if this man, who doesn't have any of that going against him, if he just develops out of his own free choice this addiction, well, he could be much more culpable. So there's a lot of factors involved. We can talk about evil in some way in objective terms, but when it comes to the subject, and especially culpability, ultimately it's something only God can fully adjudicate. I hope that helps somewhat.
But I suppose that, so a weakness is a particular weakness.
Yes, that's right.
But then there's also the responsibility of the generality of the people around you,
Absolutely.
where nobody is in isolation.
That's
right? So
right.
there's also
Yep.
sin of omission. Right?
Yes.
So if
Yes,
nobody
we're gonna-
tells you you should stop drinking, or nobody says that's wrong,
Yes.
and they know it's wrong,
Yep.
and they know you're doing it, right? There is also sin in the community.
Absolutely, yes. And what we hear in Genesis, the very beginning of Genesis, am I my brother's keeper? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
We do belong to the body, the whole human race, but the body of Christ, and we do have a responsibility, not equally for everyone. Those you are bound to more closely, you have a greater responsibility for. Those who you may be entrusted with, one who's entrusted with greater authority, a pastor has more responsibility, for souls than I do, not having that office. But we are our brother's keepers, and so no one gets to God alone. This is the part of the theology of the body, that we need the help of others in the body. So let's take a break for 10 minutes, and at 10:30 we'll start with the second talk, and then we'll have more time for questions and wrap up before noon Mass. Hello. There is a second handout here for the second lecture I'll put on the table if you want to grab one of these. Handout for lecture 2 here. Yes. Thank you. I'll just take this. Thank you very much. Friends, we're going to begin in a minute. Just one note. Father Bernard sent out an email, I think Thursday. There's a listserv of people who've been coming to this. He sent out an email reminder about this class. If you didn't get that email, if you're not on that list, if you would write your email here, there are some texts that I was going to send out to you all. So some of you are on the list. If you're not, I'll just put this sheet of paper here. If you want to add your email, we'll add you to the list so that you'll get the message. Okay.
He sent out an email about what? I don't know.
It was just a reminder about this.
okay.
Set. All right, so we're going to get started with our second talk on the nature of sin. So we're turning from the broad subject of evil to sin specifically. We'll return to the question of evil a little bit at the end of next week's session. But for the next 3 talks, we're going to focus on sin itself. So what is sin? You have at the beginning of this handout here, this second handout, Aquinas' simple definition: sin is a bad human act. Okay. Very straightforward, but it says a lot, that definition. First of all, only human acts can be sinful. And remember, a human act is necessarily a voluntary act, something that you're in control of, that you can choose to do or not do. Acts of a human, like the growth of my fingernails, I have no voluntary control over, and so it cannot be morally good or bad that my fingernails grow or don't grow, that your heart pumps blood, that your lungs keep air moving. Those are acts of a human that are not moral or immoral. Only human acts, voluntary acts, can be morally good or evil. So what is a sin? A sin is a bad human act. It's a human act that is bad. What does it mean that it's bad? It does not conform with the measure that it ought to conform to. It falls short in some way of what it's meant to be. We're talking about human acts. So what's the measure for human acts? This is a really broad topic, but there are 2 basic measures that help us to understand what our acts are meant to conform to. The first measure of human acts is human reason. Our own minds, by the gift of God, have a capacity to know what is reasonable. Not perfectly, especially because we have the wound of ignorance, and not completely. But our own human minds can tell us what's reasonable. I know that it's reasonable to drink 2 cups of tea, that it would be unreasonable, a bad human act, to drink 200 cups of tea. That's a bad human act, because it's contrary to right reason. What I know is reasonable for my body. So there is the measure of the human mind itself, which already gives us a certain degree of understanding of what's good for us and what's not. But then ultimately, all human acts are measured according to the divine reason, what Aquinas calls the eternal law, the mind of God, God's mind, which is made known to us in different ways. It's made known to us through our own minds, through the natural law, which we talked about some time ago, but ultimately through revelation. How do we know God's mind? Through revelation, through the scriptures, through the church. We know the mind of God. We know how it is that human acts are meant to be conformed to God's mind and redound to our goodness. So, a sin is a bad human act. It's a human act that doesn't conform to the right measure either of a reasonable human mind or ultimately of God's mind. But notice that a sin is an act, which is different than a vice. We're going to talk about vice next week. A vice is not an act. A vice is a habit, like virtue. Virtue is a habit, a good habit. Vice is a bad habit. Habits and acts are not the same thing. A habit is a kind of disposition to an act. If I have the habit, which I do, of playing the piano, it means that I am well disposed to be able to do this easily and well and with ease. If I have the habit of lying, it means I'm well disposed to do the act of lying. Because of repeated actions, because I've done this so many times and gotten good at it, so to speak, if I have the vice of lying, I'm well disposed to do the act. But the habit, the disposition, is different than the act, which means that the sin is always worse than vice. Because a sin is actually an act. You're actually doing something. To have the habit of lying is simply a disposition. I have to act on that habit to actually sin. Now, I can only create a bad habit by lots of sinful acts, but sin is worse than vice. Sin is an act. We approach God or we withdraw from God by acts, human acts. Habits are meant to help us so that we're not always starting from ground zero, that we have this kind of disposition built up. If it's a good habit, it helps us. If it's a bad habit, it doesn't help us. But that's the difference, the basic difference between a vice, which is a habit, and a sin, which is an act. We'll come back to vices next week. So we have our basic definition of sin. It's a bad human act. Now, in Aquinas' kind of scientific consideration of sin, remember here as a surgeon he wants to understand the differences between all different kinds of maladies. The first thing he considers is how sins differ from each other. There are a lot of different ways in which different sins, different maladies of the soul are different. So when we're trying to diagnose ourselves, to examine our own consciences, to prepare to go to confession, for example, confess our sins rightly, truly, we need to understand the exact nature of our sin. And understanding these differences between sin can really help. So, we have differences here. The first way in which sins differ, most basically, is with regard to what he calls the object. Remember when we were talking about moral acts, the object is simply what it is that's being done, as opposed to why I'm doing it. What is being done? Sins differ, basically, in terms of what is being done, the object of the act, such that a sin of theft is a different thing from a sin of lying, which is a different thing from a sin of adultery, principally because of what is being done. The act of theft, the act of lying, the act of adultery, obviously, are very different things. So first, it's not helpful to just say, well, I've sinned. I need to understand, well, what exactly? What is the object of my sin? What have I done? Because to say I've committed the sin of theft versus the sin of lying, that's a very different thing. I need to understand the object of the act, what I've done. All right, so the most basic difference between sins regards the very act of what is done. It's one of the most basic ways in which not all sins are equal, because not all bad acts are equal. The second way that sins are different is the difference between what he calls spiritual sins and carnal sins. He's taking here as a framework, which we'll touch on briefly next week, the 7 deadly sins. Of the 7 deadly sins, he says 5 of them are spiritual, 2 of them are carnal. The carnal ones, the most obvious ones, are gluttony and lust. They deal with the body. But what's this difference between spiritual sin and carnal sin? Every sin is about a desire for some good. Now, it's wrongly understood. I'm pursuing a good either in the wrong way, or I'm pursuing something that's not really good, but it appears to me to be good. But in every human act, I'm going after a good. And I'm going after a good, either whether it's a true good or an apparent good, I'm going after it because it promises to give me some pleasure. Now, it may be a false promise if it's an apparent good. But we are designed such that we go after goods in order to get pleasure. So St. Thomas says that the difference between spiritual sin and carnal sin is with the kind of pleasure they give. Spiritual sins give a kind of spiritual pleasure. By spiritual, he simply means something interior within the soul, not of the body, within the soul. Carnal sins give carnal pleasure, pleasure that we feel in the body. So he says sins that consist in spiritual pleasure are spiritual sins, such as pride, anger, envy. The kind of pleasure, even though it's not a true pleasure, that these sins promise is something I feel within me. Whereas gluttony and lust redound to a kind of bodily pleasure. So in thinking about our own moral lives and coming before God, asking for forgiveness, it's helpful to consider, do I have more of a problem with spiritual sins or carnal sins? Because the remedies, the paths of healing are going to be different. Am I more inclined to sins that appeal to me interiorly in my soul? The pride, the disdain with which I look down upon someone, or the angry feelings that I harbor within me? Or am I more inclined to sensual, carnal sins that are really about delight in the body, kind of bodily delight? That's one division. Next, a very important division with regard to sin. The person sinned against: God, myself, or my neighbor. Who is being sinned against? Now, we should say at the outset that every sin is a sin against God. That God's ordering of all things to himself includes every other human ordering. The ordering of my mind by which I act reasonably toward myself, or say, human law by which we act reasonably with each other. God's ordering encompasses all of that, such that if I sin against my neighbor in theft, that is also a sin against God's ordering of all things. So, firstly, every sin is an offense against God. However, in a more proximate way, there are direct persons who are injured by our sins. Theft and murder, for example, are directly against one's neighbor. They're also an offense against God, but they are directly against one's neighbor, whereas gluttony and lust are sins against myself. I'm harming myself, injuring myself, first and foremost. At the same time, there are sins that are directly against God, that are not against myself or my neighbor in a direct way. These are sins that can only be known by revelation. They're not sins against human reason or against human law. For example, the sin of heresy, the sin of sacrilege, of blasphemy, hatred of God. These are directly against God himself, which is a very different thing. In diagnosing our spiritual maladies, it's very important to recognize, are my biggest problems in struggling with sin with regard to myself, sinning against my neighbor, or sinning against God? It's far worse to sin against God directly than to sin against my neighbor. Not to say that one cannot lose his soul in any of these domains, but to sin directly against God in an act of blasphemy, in an act of hatred of God, is a far more grave reality. We'll talk about gravity here in a minute, than a sin that's directly against my neighbor, because of the good that is being offended, the infinite good of God versus the finite good of a human life. Thinking about the person sinned against, St. Thomas says this also helps us to understand the virtues that are sinned against. Virtues in some way are a remedy for sin. If I sin directly against God, I'm sinning against the theological virtues of faith, of hope, of love. Hatred of God is a sin directly against love. Blasphemy, heresy, these are sins against faith. So to consider the person sinned against is also to see the virtue that's being sinned against. If I sin against my neighbor, it's necessarily some species of a sin against justice. If I sin against myself, it's a sin against temperance or fortitude in some way. So when we consider the one who is sinned against, we can see the virtue sinned against, which also shows the path of virtue that we need to cultivate. If I sin against myself in intemperance, well, temperance, the virtue of temperance is what I most need to overcome these sins against intemperance. If I continually have problems with anger towards my neighbor, well, then justice, different ways of cultivating justice are going to be paramount. Another distinction is between sins of commission and sins of omission. In God's law, which he gives us primarily in divine revelation, also in the natural law, but primarily in divine revelation, in God's law there are two kinds of precepts. There are negative and positive precepts. So a negative precept says, do not do this. Thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not commit adultery. It's forbidding you to do something. A positive precept is commanding you to do something. You shall Keep holy the Sabbath. You shall honor your father and mother. Okay, so a command to do something positively or a negative precept forbidding. A sin of commission is a sin that violates a negative precept. I do something that I've been commanded not to do. I steal, and I've been commanded to not steal. So sins of commission directly go against the negative precepts of the law. Sins of omission are directly against the positive precepts. I've been commanded to keep holy the Sabbath. If I don't do that, if I omit doing that, I'm not fulfilling the command of the positive precept. So that's the basic division between sins of omission and commission. Something I do which I've been commanded not to do, or something I fail to do that I have been commanded to do. So again, we can ask ourselves, when I examine my own soul, do I struggle more with doing things that I'm commanded not to do? Or do I struggle more with not doing the things that I have been commanded to do? There are different kinds of moral problems that require different kinds of responses. Do I struggle more with sins of commission, breaking the negative precepts of the law, or with sins of omission, in not fulfilling the positive precepts of the law? Next, we have sins of excess and deficiency. So here we're talking about moral virtues, like the virtues of temperance and fortitude. And with regard to the moral virtues, St. Thomas's basic principle that he takes from Aristotle is this. In medio, that's an E, stat virtus. Virtue stands in the middle. In medio stat virtus. Virtue stands in the middle. In the middle of what? Virtue stands in the middle of two extremes, the extreme of excess and the extreme of defect. Both of those are sinful extremes. Virtue is right in the middle. It's the mean, the virtuous mean between what is excessive and what is defective. So think about the virtue of fortitude. The excessive sin would be daring in a way that's unreasonable. I'm so daring that I'm sinning because I'm doing what really I should not do. It's unreasonable for me to do. That's an excessive form of fortitude. A defective form of fortitude would be cowardice. The virtue stands in the middle between the excessive sin of daring and the defect of cowardice. In the middle stands virtue. All right, so you can have sins that are more a matter of excess or more a matter of deficiency. It's possible to be motivated in different ways. So for example, temperance, the virtue of temperance. Temperance deals with bodily goods, being moderate, so that my pursuit of bodily goods, principally food, drink, and sex, if one is married, my pursuit of bodily goods is reasonable in a way that conduces to the good of my whole being. I can be excessive, which is called intemperance. I throw myself into a pursuit of food, drink, or sex in an unreasonable way. Or I can be defective. This is not so common, but it's a theoretical possibility that I don't appreciate in any way the good of food, drink, or sex, and so I abstain altogether. It's obviously a moral evil if I, have such a, Aquinas calls this insensibility, such an insensibility for food and drink that I don't want to eat or drink at all. The point is that those different extremes are motivated by different things. Intemperance, so let's take food. I just live for food. I want food all the time in an excessive way. That's motivated by love. I'm motivated by my love for food. The problem is that the love is out of order. It's too excessive. It's too extreme. Whereas defect is motivated by hatred. If I hate food or drink, then I'm deficient, I'm insensible in a way that's unreasonable. So if you have more of a problem with sins of excess, it means that you're motivated by love, which is a good thing, but your loves are not rightly ordered. And so dealing with disordered loves. Love is about the good. Food is a good, drink is a good, sex is a good. but loving it in the right way. Whereas if you have problems with sins of defect, say we go back to fortitude and the defect is cowardice, you're moved by a hatred. If you're a cowardly person, you're moved by a hatred for any kind of having to exert any kind of arduous effort. So in the face of this dangerous thing, this difficult thing, I don't want to exert any effort. I have a hatred for having to work hard. Well, that's a different problem, dealing with that hatred, than it is dealing with a disordered love. So a different way of diagnosing the maladies, the underlying problems in our lives of bad human actions. All right, next we have sins of thought, word, and deed. Sins of thought, word, and deed are really all differences in degree. They're differences in degree. St. Thomas says that the beginning of sin is in the sin of thought. Sin begins with some idea, some thought, something that appears to me to be good. The second degree, moving further then, he says, is a sin of word. Not that every sin has to manifest itself in words, but he's speaking generally here that from thought, you then externalize the thought in a word. And finally, it comes to consummation in an act. So, this may be more obvious with spiritual sins. For example, anger. An angry man is first disturbed in his thought with a desire for vengeance. And then, if he allows that sin to move forward, if he doesn't stop it, then those evil thoughts give rise to evil words, say words of insult, either to the person that I'm angry at or to someone else about that person. And then they finally, if the sin continues, manifest themselves in harmful deeds. So that anger can give rise ultimately to really injurious deeds. Ultimately, murder is something that comes from anger within. The same, he says, applies to lust. You begin with a thought, can continue into external deeds. There's an ancient rabbinic, so from the ancient Jewish rabbis, an interpretation of the first line of Psalm 1. The opening of the book of Psalms says this: "Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the way of sinners, nor sit in the company of scorners." The ancient rabbis saw the progression of these three verbs as a similar kind of noting the degree to which one invests himself in sin. So, blessed is the one who does not walk in the company with sinners. If you walk with someone, what's implied here is that you are kind of in conversation, you're being influenced by them, you're talking with them. But that's not as bad as then standing. Walking, you're still moving forward, but if you stand in the counsel of the wicked, well, something more definitive has happened. You've moved from simply walking, kind of maybe considering a temptation, a bad thought, to now standing still. You've made a choice. Finally, sitting in the company of the wicked. Now you're fully at rest. Blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the way of sinners, nor sit in the company of scoffers. A degree, a progression that we can think about with regard to sin. That we first consider something in our minds, and then we choose it to some degree, and finally we fully give ourselves over to it. Now, I want to say something about the first category, sins of thought, because often people have a lot of questions about sins of thought. The other two categories are pretty straightforward. Sins of words, you know what that's like. We're all guilty, have been guilty at times of sinful words, sins of deed, actions. But what about sins of thought? What does it mean to have a sin of thought? Are all bad thoughts sinful? To answer this question, St. Thomas makes yet another distinction. I may have told you the medieval phrase, when you're faced with a question, the medieval adage says, never deny outright, seldom affirm outright, always distinguish. So the mode of inquiry for the medievals, the scholastics, was always to try to get more precise, make more distinctions before giving an absolute answer. Don't say no outright. Often don't say yes outright. Try to distinguish the question more. So is a sin of thought always, is a bad thought always a sin? Aquinas makes a further distinction between cogitation, pleasure, and consent. And this is all within the soul here. In thinking about a sin of thought, we need to consider these three levels. Cogitation. Cogitation is the basic way in which the mind functions. Something is presented to the mind. How do things get presented to the mind? Through the senses. I see something, I hear something, or things can be presented to the mind through the imagination or the memory, and things can be presented to the mind by the evil one, kind of external temptation. All right, so something crosses the mind, let's say an evil thought, a bad thought. At the most basic level of cogitation, we can't control everything that passes our mind. Something I see, something I hear, some memory, some temptation that comes across my mind. Cogitation is not where sin happens. It's simply the way in which the mind works. If I see something that is attractive to me, but in a disordered way, a sinful way, well, I can't help the fact that, okay, say it wasn't my fault at all that I saw this. The fact that I've seen it, my mind has registered it, something happens in my mind. I recognize what it is, my mind cogitates, okay. That's not something we can control. Now, there are ways in which we do need to protect ourselves, be prudent in protecting ourselves from things that we ought not encounter, that could be an occasion for sin. But his point is that if I then take pleasure, in what has crossed my mind, this is where sin begins. Because to take pleasure is already to give myself to it, to say yes to it in some way. So an evil thought could pass my mind, and I have the capacity, not that it's always the easiest thing to do, it can take some real virtue in building up the habit. I have the capacity to say, no, that's not good for me, it's not reasonable, I don't want that, I'm turning away from that. I might have to do it 100 times in a row in my mind to turn myself away from it. But if I say yes, if I kind of delight in it, within my mind, delight in the thought of this evil thing, I've already entered the realm of the voluntary then. I have chosen to think about, think about the possibility, how could I do this? I have an evil thought of how I want to take vengeance on someone who's harmed me. If I take pleasure, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I really made his life miserable? How I could, do this. That is something I'm freely choosing to do. So sin begins here, but ultimately sin is consummated with consent. When I decide, yes, I'm going to do this. This thing that I've been thinking about, that I have taken pleasure in my mind, I'm going to do it. All right, so with regard to sins of thought, it is not a sin if an evil thought crosses your mind, a temptation, if you see something that is tempting to you. The question is what you do about it, how you turn away from it, not taking pleasure in it, not dwelling upon it, thinking about how pleasurable this would be, and certainly not consenting to it. So a sin of thought does not mean simply the fact that you are tempted in some way by something. All right. Now, at the same time, while it's true that we don't have complete control over what passes our mind, we can't shut ourselves off completely from the external world, nor can we shut ourselves off completely from temptation, from the evil one. So we don't have complete control over the ideas that pass through our mind. But we can, not in an absolute way, but more and more we can habituate ourselves to holy thoughts. Think about what St. Paul says to the Philippians. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there be any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Think about good things, about holy things, about honorable things, about pure things. The more that we give ourselves over to the good, especially at the level of cogitation, thinking about God, about the highest things, about whatever has excellence and goodness in it, will habituate our mind to the good, such that when evil things do come to our mind, it'll be much easier to say, no, I'm not taking pleasure in that, because I have habituated myself to taking pleasure in good things. I take pleasure in what is right and honorable and just and pure and lovely. So we can help ourselves in building intellectual habits of delighting in the true and the good and the beautiful, which when evil does cross our mind, which it will at times, it'll be much easier then to turn away from it. If we've gotten habituated to taking pleasure in evil things, well, we have a habit that makes it more difficult then, that needs to be worked against. All right, now the last category here of the difference between sins is what St. Thomas refers to as the debt of punishment. And this has to do with mortal and venial sin. Now, very interestingly, in common catechesis about sin, the categories of mortal and venial sin are most often the only distinction we ever hear when it comes to sin. Is it a mortal sin? Is it a venial sin? Very often in Catholic teaching, this is the only distinction that is made reference to. For St. Thomas, this is far from the most important distinction. It is not at all the most important distinction for a scientific understanding of sin. Why? Because all mortal and venial sin tells you is something about the punishment for your sin. It doesn't tell you about the nature of the sin. Am I in the state of mortal sin? Well, that does say a lot, undoubtedly. It's an important thing that tells me. But for the sake of overcoming sin, it doesn't tell me anything. What is the nature of my sin? What have I done? Have I sinned against God, against myself, against my neighbor? Have I sinned by omission or commission, by excess, by deficiency? To know whether I'm in the state of mortal or venial sin says something very important, but it doesn't give you any real substance to know about the nature of your sin, and therefore to be able to understand how to grow out of sin, the proper remedy. Which is to say, while it's necessary and very important to know whether sin is deadly or not deadly, in the words of Scripture, we need to know a lot more about the nature of sin in order to properly understand where we find ourselves vis-a-vis God and seek the remedies that are really particular to our situation. All right, so it's not the most important category, but it is an important thing to understand. So what does St. Thomas teach about the debt of punishment, the difference between mortal and venial sin? Ultimately, he says this is a distinction between death and sickness. Mortal sin is death-dealing. It destroys the life of God in the soul. Such as the first sin, it cuts off that relationship in an absolute way. Venial sin is akin to sickness in the soul. It doesn't destroy the life of the soul, but it introduces a sickness into the soul. Friendship with God remains in the state of venial sin, though it's injured in some way. There is a sickness present. St. Thomas's formal distinction between mortal and venial sin is about man's final end. Remember, we began at the beginning with the final end. God is our end. We are made for God. We are on our way to God. Mortal sin, this is the technical definition of mortal sin for St. Thomas. And it's a scary thing. Mortal sin is the replacement of God as final end with something else. I replace God as my final end with some other thing, some lesser thing. Instead of living for God above all else as my ultimate end, which orders every other pursuit, I'm living for something else. I've replaced God as my final end. I live for something else, either myself or some lesser good, another person or some created good. It's ultimately a kind of idolatry. to order my life, my love, around something other than God. This is why the first commandment, the greatest commandment, is you shall love the Lord your God with your whole mind, your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole strength. To love something else other than God with my whole mind, my whole heart, my whole strength is to be in the state of mortal sin. Something else has replaced God as the first, the ultimate, the final love of my life. Whereas venial sin doesn't replace God as my final end. I'm still on my way to God. I still love God as the first love of my life. And yet, in some lesser way, I'm choosing something that isn't ordered to God. Without turning away from God, ultimately, as mortal sin does, venial sin is, to be continually driving through potholes. Instead of being on the smooth road, I'm driving into potholes, things that are not conducive to my movement toward God in the best possible way. Venial sin, Aquinas says, is naturally reparable. It can naturally be healed. The word venial in Latin comes from the word that means something that's naturally forgivable. So we have a real offense here, but it's naturally reparable, meaning if I ask God for forgiveness, if I make an act of contrition, venial sin is forgiven. It can be healed by my own action, by my own asking for forgiveness. Mortal sin is not naturally reparable. I can't heal mortal sin by simply asking for forgiveness. Only God heals mortal sin, and he does so principally through the sacrament that he established in the church for the forgiveness of sins. Confession heals mortal sin. That's God's action. I have to seek the grace that he's given in his goodness. If God hadn't established baptism or confession, mortal sin could never be forgiven. Whereas venial sin is naturally forgivable. If I'm contrite, I ask God for forgiveness, my venial sin is forgiven. Every time we receive the Eucharist, all venial sin is forgiven. So venial sin is a whole different thing than mortal sin, such that it's so different that St. Thomas, here speaking scientifically, theologically, says that venial sin is sin in an imperfect sense, in an analogical sense. It's a sin by analogy. Sin, in the full sense of the word, is mortal sin. That's sin in the, quote, perfect sense, meaning the fullest possible sense. When the Bible speaks about sin, that's what it's speaking about. Now, 1 John, of course, does distinguish. There is sin that is deadly, there is sin that is not. But in the history of salvation, when we're talking about sin, we're talking about sin in the full sense of the term. Aquinas says that venial sin is not sin in the full sense of the term. It's sin by a kind of analogy. It doesn't have the full character of sin. There is a real offense, and it does injure us, it does wound us, but it's not sin in the full-blown sense. Now, very often, as a confessor, people will ask in confession, is this a mortal sin? They confess something they've done, and they say, is it a mortal sin? And often, it's not possible to give a definitive answer. Why? Let's first just look at what the Catechism says. You're probably familiar with these categories, the basic three components of mortal sin. The Catechism, number 1857, says, for a sin to be mortal, three conditions must be met. One, the object, what is being done, must be grave matter, serious matter. Second, it must be committed with full knowledge. And third, with deliberate consent. To be guilty of a mortal sin, to destroy the life of God in the soul, one must be guilty of a sin whose object is grave matter with full knowledge of what they're doing and deliberate consent. All right. Even at the first level, it's not always so easy to be able to determine whether a certain object is grave matter or not. Now, certain things, it's very clear. This is a grave matter. But take anger. for example. There's anger that is grave, and there's anger that is not grave. One of the ways St. Thomas says that you might be able to discern the difference is with regard to the injury intended. Anger is ordered to injury. Is my anger really aimed at an injury that's really significant? I want to destroy this man's reputation. That's a very grave kind of injury, to destroy someone's good name. So he'll lose his job and he'll be scorned. Or an anger that's aimed at an injury that's very minor. That's one way of starting to delineate between whether the object is grave or not. But it's not always entirely clear where the line falls on some spectrums. In some cases it's very clear because of the nature of the injury is so serious. But even with regard to the object, it's not always perfectly clear. When a person asks me, is this a mortal sin? Well, we start with the object, what's being done, and figure out, is this grave or not? And might say, it seems like this is serious, grave matter, or it's not entirely clear, have to consider it more. But with regard to the next two conditions, this is something that can also be difficult to determine. Does the person have full knowledge of what they're doing? It's difficult to determine because the sinner themselves doesn't have full and perfect knowledge of themselves and of their own actions. We are deceived about ourselves in different ways. We don't have full and perfect self-knowledge. Now, at times a person can know, yes, I really knew what I was doing. I really knew how evil it was, and I fully chose it. Okay. If a person in their conscience really is convicted, they knew what they were doing, they fully chose it, then it's a grave matter, then yes, you have a case of mortal sin, and by God's grace, every mortal sin can be forgiven by the sacrament of confession. But ultimately, this is just to say that ultimately only God can judge the degree of knowledge that a person has and the degree of their consent. So we had a question about addiction before. Once a habit is in place, a vicious habit like addiction, now there can certainly be consent in building that habit, perhaps in repeated acts, but once it's in place, it can significantly decrease the amount of freedom in acting from the addiction. Only God can fully and perfectly judge a soul and know the degree of freedom present, the degree of knowledge. The point is that our conscience is meant to guide us. If we feel ourselves guilty in our conscience of a sin, we simply go to confession and confess our sin and contrition and seek forgiveness. We don't have to be able to adjudicate absolutely, am I in the state of mortal sin or not? We can't always know this perfectly as God can know it. But if we in conscience feel we're in the state of sin, then we go. We need not hesitate. We should always go to confession if our conscience convicts us of sin. A well-formed conscience is the best guide to knowing whether we are in a state of friendship with God or not, whether we need to seek the sacrament or not. Which is to say that the sacrament of confession was instituted for the forgiveness of mortal sins. The sacrament of confession is not necessary for the forgiveness of venial sin. As we already talked about, venial sin is naturally reparable. You need only make an act of contrition to God, ask for his forgiveness, receive the Eucharist. Now, it's good to confess venial sins in confession, especially if you have habitual venial sins, but it's not necessary to confess venial sins in confession. The sacrament of confession is for the removal of mortal sin. A few other notes about mortal and venial sin. A venial sin can never become a mortal sin, meaning one venial sin, one unkind word, that I say kind of in an offhanded way, that was a very foolish comment he made. That cannot become a mortal sin. Nor can the culmination, the adding up of venial sins ever amount to a mortal sin. It's the difference between grave matter and matter that is not grave. An unkind word in a passing way is not a grave thing. That venial matter can't become grave matter. And the adding up of 10 of those in a week doesn't become grave matter. It's a different kind of matter, material, object of what is being done. Whereas, if I say something that is really meant to destroy a person's reputation, if I utter calumny, something that's not true, in order to destroy someone's good name. Well, that is a grave thing in itself. That's different than a passing word, an unkind word about someone. So mortal and venial sin are really categorically different. However, it is important to note that venial sin is a disposition to mortal sin. Venial sin is not insignificant. It is sin. It does wound us. And the more that we sin venially, especially if we don't take care to try to overcome these more minor imperfections, the more we can be disposed to falling into mortal sin. Because the more that one sins venially without trying to overcome mortal sin, the more he becomes accustomed to turning away his will from God, even in a small way, and therefore disposed to a much greater turning against God in mortal sin. So sin always injures us. We don't want to give the impression here that venial sin is insignificant, that it's really not a matter of concern at all. It is. It's an injury, it's an offense against God. It's not death-dealing, but it is a sickness, and sickness can grow, and sickness can dispose us to death, to spiritual death, if we don't seek to overcome the different sicknesses brought about by venial sin. All right, so those are the principal ways in which sins differ from one another. To try to understand, to diagnose, well, what is the nature of this sin versus that? We can be helped by thinking in these different categories. Not all sins are connected with each other. Not all sins are connected. Some sins are directly opposed to each other. I can't be at the same time a gluttonous person and an insensible person who has a hatred for food. Those sins are contrary to each other. This is important because Aquinas teaches that all virtues are connected with each other. All virtues are connected, such that if I ultimately have the perfection of virtue, which is had in charity, I have all virtues. I have the full organism of virtues. That's not the case with sin. If I have one sin, it doesn't mean that I have every sin. Sins are not all connected in an organic way, even though they can give rise to different sins. Virtue is a kind of living organism that if I have perfect virtue, I have the full life of virtue. Why? Because goodness unites. Love, which is the nature of God, is unitive. To the degree that I live in God's love, everything is united within me around the good. But evil disunites. And so we live scattered lives. Our lives are broken up. Instead of being united all around the good, we are scattered in pursuit of different evils. So not all sins are connected with each other, and not all sins are equal with each other. So we're going to consider, for our last topic here this morning, the difference in the gravity of sin, which depends, again, on different things. How do we know the gravity, how grave something is? It depends on several things. First, the object. What is being done? Some objects are simply more grave or serious. The gravity of sin varies, Aquinas says, in the way that one sickness is more grave than another. A sin is more grave insofar as it attacks a higher end. It works against a higher end. Therefore, a sin which is against the very substance of man, murder, to destroy a person's being, that's more grave than a sin which is about external things, theft, because it attacks a higher end. My being is a higher end than the being of my car, the substance of my car. So a sin that attacks my being, murder, is more grave than a sin that attacks a lower thing. A sin that is directly against God, therefore, is the most grave of all. It attacks the highest end of all. So first we have to consider what is being done and what is being attacked by that sin, the nature of the end or the object being attacked. We can also then consider virtues to which the sins are opposed. Aristotle said that the worst is opposed to the best. Okay? Logical. The worst is opposed to the best. So in the moral life, the best is the greatest virtue, and the worst is the most grievous sin. And the worst sin is directly against the greatest virtue. What is the greatest virtue? Charity. Faith, hope, and love remain, and the greatest of these is love. The love of God is the greatest virtue. Therefore, the greatest sin, the most grievous matter, is directly against the greatest virtue. Hatred of God is the greatest sin, because love of God is the greatest virtue. It's important to recognize this. It kind of involves a reordering in our conception. Sometimes, if you ask, say, a well-catechized school kid, what's the greatest sin? They might say something like murder. Murder is a very grievous sin, but it is far from the greatest sin. Murder is directly against one's neighbor, taking the life of one's neighbor. It is a far more grievous thing to sin directly against God, to hate God, to lie about God in heresy, to blaspheme God, because of the good that is being sinned against. Yes, my neighbor's life is a tremendous good, but it is nothing compared to God's own being, to the good of God. Sins that are directly against God are far more grave than sins against our neighbor or against ourselves. Again, it's not to say that I can't lose my soul by a grave sin against my neighbor. Absolutely, I can. But it's a different kind of malady in my soul. Murder is a different kind of malady. What gives rise to murder is a different thing than what gives rise to hatred of God. And therefore, if we're really concerned with healing these maladies, it requires a very different kind of medicine. All right, next, spiritual and carnal sins. Spiritual sins are of greater guilt than carnal sins. Now, he's speaking here categorically, on the whole. Spiritual sins as a category are of greater guilt than carnal sins, though he does say that carnal sins are of more shame. Why? Because carnal sins, lust, gluttony, make us more like brute animals who are beneath us. Carnal sins lower us to something less than ourselves. Now, to say that spiritual sins are of greater guilt than carnal sins, it doesn't mean that every spiritual sin is worse than every carnal sin. I could have a spiritual sin that's venial and a carnal sin that's grave matter, and that would be a worse thing. But categorically speaking, generally speaking, spiritual sins are more grave. Why? We have in our soul the capacity to turn toward God or to turn away from God. Spiritual sins are sins immediately in the soul that deal with this capacity to turn toward God or turn away from God. Carnal sins belong to the lower part of our souls and are caught up in the body. Carnal sins are really about turning toward goods of the body. So you see the difference. In a spiritual sin, in my soul, I directly choose to turn away from God. Whereas in a carnal sin, I'm not thinking about God. I'm thinking about some lower good that I'm turning toward. In a carnal sin, I turn toward a bodily good. In a spiritual sin, I'm turning away. This is Aquinas' main distinction. Spiritual sins denote more a turning away from the highest good, and carnal sins denote more of a turning toward, well, kind of ignoring the higher. So all carnal sins are sins against one's own body, whereas spiritual sins can be sins against God, sins against neighbor, anger, sins against myself, interiorly, hatred of myself. But sins against my own soul, against my neighbor, against God, these are all things that are meant to be loved more than my body. This is another question, but I ought to love God most of all, and then my own soul, and then the soul of my neighbor, and then my body. This is Aquinas' ordering of loves. So sins that deal with my own body are of a lower nature than sins that are against God or my soul or my neighbor's soul. So the gravity of sin is caught up in whether in my soul I'm really turning away from God, or in my body am I turning towards some lesser good and just kind of not thinking about spiritual things. Another reason he says that spiritual sins in general are of less guilt less gravity than mortal sins, is because in our body we have a much stronger impulse from the cravings of the flesh for carnal sins. So we're driven more strongly, especially by disordered concupiscence, to carnal sins. There's a stronger motivation, a stronger kind of weakness that we're susceptible to. Whereas spiritual sins are much more cold and deliberate. We don't have this bodily impulse, driving us. Spiritual sins like anger, like envy, pride, these are things that are much more intentional. We have less excuse. I wasn't being, I didn't see that 2 pounds of ice cream before me just, pulling me. No, in a spiritual sin, it's something that's much more rational, deliberate. Again, to be clear, one can lose his soul in either category, by carnal or venial, spiritual sins. But in thinking about gravity, there's a greater kind of malady present in a spiritual sin because of a turning away from God. Now, the next thing to consider is the will to sin. Sin is chiefly in the will. All sin is ultimately in the will. It's a choice, a voluntary choice. And so the stronger the will I have to sin, the more grievous the sin will be. As we'll see next week, some sins arise more out of passion, out of emotion, as the main motive force. That's a different thing. Still can be very grave, but it's a different thing from a sin that is directly, where the will is really most directly involved, which would be called a sin of malice. The more that the will is invested in this sin, the more grave it is. Whereas a sin of passion could be a sin of weakness. I really am drawn to this thing, and I know that I ought not to do it, but my will is too weak to do what I ought to do, so I give in. The will is less fully engaged there. The will kind of capitulates in a weak way, rather than when I really knowingly, willingly want to do this evil thing. So the degree of the investment of the will says a lot about the grievousness of the sin. A few last points then. The harm done. The harm done can indicate something about the gravity. Sometimes the harm done by sin is foreseen and it's intended. So when I do something with the intention of harming another, murder, theft, the quantity of harm done says something about the grievousness. So there's less harm done in stealing a $5 bill than there is in stealing $500,000. So the quantity of harm done says something about the gravity of the sin, especially if that injury, that harm done, is something that I'm intending. I willingly foresee it. Then there's some interesting considerations about the condition of the person sinned against. The condition of the person that you sin against can vary the degree of gravity in the sin. For example, if you sin against a person who is more closely united to God, either because he's more virtuous or because he's more sacred to God, this sin, Aquinas says, redounds to God himself. Some people are more closely united to God than others. To sin against a person more closely united to God is a greater offense against God. To sin against, a saint, if someone, God forbid, had taken the life and murder of Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta, that's a more grave offense because of her union with God than it is, frankly, and it can be difficult to grasp this, but that it is to take the life of someone who is far, far, far from God. It's a grave offense to take anyone's life, but it's more grave if the injury is against someone who's more closely united to God. Also, secondly, an injury is worse if it's against one who's more closely united to yourself. Through bonds, family bonds, to sin against one's own family is worse. It's more grievous than to sin against a stranger. Or someone who's more closely united to yourself by kindness, someone who's done an incredibly kind thing for you, to sin against that person has a further degree of gravity. And regarding neighbor, a man sins more grievously if his sin affects more people. So a sin committed against a public person who, by his office, stands in place of the whole, that's a more grievous thing than to sin against a private citizen who doesn't take the place of a whole. So let's take the example of a monarchy. A monarch who is a public personage who has a particular role above and beyond an ordinary citizen, to sin against that person is something that affects much more broadly the society than to sin against a private individual. This is not to diminish these lesser matters, but to say that there are different personal aspects that can add even more gravity to a sin. Likewise, he says a person of prominence. To sin against a person of prominence can be more grave because of the scandal or disturbance it would cause to the many, because of the further consequences. Finally, considering oneself, the one sinning, the excellence of the one sinning. The personal excellence of the one sinning affects the gravity of the sin. If I am a person of excellent moral virtue, a person who's really very virtuous and even, known, it's something visible to others. If I sin in a grievous way, being a person of greater moral excellence, that's a more grievous thing. Why? Because a more excellent person is a person who excels in knowledge and virtue, and therefore they can more easily resist sin because of the greater knowledge and virtue they have. So if the more excellent person falls into sin, when they're in a position to more easily resist it, it's a more serious thing. Also, he says, on account of ingratitude, because every good that a man has, by which a man excels, is a gift from God. Some people are given more excellence, more grace, more gifts than others. If the person who's been given so much by God sins in a really grave way, that person is guilty of a great ingratitude to God who has given him such grace, such excellence. Also, on account of the sinful act being especially inconsistent with the excellence of the person sinning or the office of the person sinning. So here you can think about certain offices that God has established, for example, the priesthood. It's a more grave thing. You take the same sin, the sin of fornication. It's a more grave sin for a man who is a priest to commit this sin than for a man who is a layman in the world, because of the excellence of the office he has been given. It's a more grave reality, even if the sin is materially the same thing. All right, so these are all different ways in which gravity can differ. Ultimately, the gravity of sin is only something that can be weighed by God. But these are different scientific ways, you might say, that we can consider, well, how grave is this? What needs to be taken into account? There's a lot of differences among sin. The whole point in our consideration of sin is to be able to avoid it and to be healed of the sin that we do commit, the struggles that we do have of sin. And to do all of that, we need to understand better the nature of sin so that we can see ourselves more clearly and seek from God the special remedies that we need. I'm going to send out in an email on that list a short article, 5 or 6 pages, from a great 20th century Dominican theologian, Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. It's about the interesting topic of what's called a predominant fault. In the early monastic tradition of the church, the desert tradition, these desert fathers and mothers spoke about a predominant fault. They surmised that every person ultimately has kind of one predominant fault that really gives rise to the whole struggle of sin that they deal with. And the predominant fault can be a very different thing. For some person, the predominant fault might be lust. For another, it might be anger. For another, it might be vanity. For another, it might be pride. But coming to know one's predominant fault can be very helpful in figuring out then what St. Thomas talks about as a predominant virtue, a virtue that is the exact remedy for that. So we can at times make a kind of laundry list of our sins, like when we go to confession, I've done this and this and this and this, but what's at the heart of it all? Why do I do many of these things? Is there some underlying malady, sickness that I suffer? Maybe my sins don't have anything to do with gluttony. Maybe I don't struggle at all with intemperance with regard to goods of the body, but maybe I really struggle with anger. And that gives rise to all kinds of things that I don't even immediately see are connected or are the fruits, the bad fruits of that. So the article is helpful to kind of think about predominant fault. He talks about some different ways to help understand what one's predominant fault is. So I'll send that out in the email. All right, we've covered a lot of ground at kind of fast speed here. And we've got a few minutes now for questions. Anything you'd like to explore further? Anything that doesn't make any sense? Yes, ma'am, let me get this. Where did that? Oh, thank you.
Yeah, this isn't right related to this, but since you mentioned Mother Teresa,
Yes.
they talked about her having the dark night of the soul, and for so many years that she felt like she said that God wasn't with her. My theory is he was with her so strongly she couldn't even put it into words. What do you think about that?
The dark night of the soul is a very, profound spiritual phenomenon. And it's really important. The most important thing with regard to any kind of spiritual trial or test like that is the difference between feeling, human sentiment, feeling, and faith. Mother Teresa lived a life of profound faith and hope in the midst of a lack of any kind of sensible consolation and indeed the feeling of being separated from God. Feelings are pretty unreliable things. Feelings can give us some true knowledge, but they do not necessarily. So God can allow a person to, at a sensible level, which is the lowest level of the soul, have a kind of experience of darkness, of absence, which does not at all mean that there is absence or that a person is in a state of moral darkness. It requires a tremendous amount of faith, which is an act of the intellect, of knowing the truth about God and of hope. So theologically, that's what's most significant with regard to darkness in the soul. But we could also say, the Eastern tradition loves to emphasize the kind of apophatic approach to God, that God is so other, so radically beyond us, that when we come near to God, we experience darkness. God's light is so overwhelming that we experience a kind of darkness in approaching the light. Again, it's something that has more to do with the sensible level of the soul, and we live our life in this world by faith. We walk by faith and not by sight, not by what we see. But the life of heaven will be sight. In heaven, the very life of heaven is the vision of God. We will see God face to face and know him as he is. Another question? Yes?
How does one best inform their conscience and feel confident
Good. How does one best inform his or her conscience and have the confidence that they know rightly between right and wrong? Okay, good. Well, how do you inform your conscience? Firstly, conscience is something that's intellectual. It exists in the mind. So learning. Consciences aren't well formed, can't be well formed without formation, intellectual formation. This starts in the most basic way with coming to know divine revelation, the basic contours of the divine law. But something like this, studying theology, reading good books, even if it's not a direct, okay, I'm downloading material into my conscience. The conscience is formed. Any contact that we have with the truth that is God, is formative. The degree of contact, the degree to which we are able to open our minds and our hearts to truth, forms our mind in conformity with the truth. So, in a basic way, studying, learning, asking questions, seeking guidance, help. Keep in mind that as much as we do suffer in different ways with the state of corrupt human nature, God is at work to draw us to himself. The priority of God, the priority of grace, of goodness. And God draws us to himself in a very direct way through our conscience, the working of our conscience. So we should always have confidence in grace, in the power of God to make function well what he himself has designed. A person who lives a sacramental life, who goes to confession regularly, at least once a month, who's receiving the Eucharist, you can have great confidence that grace is at work. Maybe your conscience is not yet perfect. Maybe it's something that requires time, but you can have a confidence that you have a good innate sense of moral right and wrong, and that when your conscience really troubles you and bothers you, that there is something wrong and that you should seek God. The way in which consciences are deformed is through a life of, intentionally choosing against God, a life of intentional sin, of vice, of being habituated intentionally to evil, to falsehood. We create obstacles. The conscience becomes, more and more, you might say, kind of paralyzed, because you might say that the conscience lives off of truth. Its oxygen is truth. The degree to which it comes in contact with truth is the degree to which it can breathe and work within us. Only the truth has grace. So I think we should have a confidence that living a sacramental life wherein we receive the grace of God, seeking truth, seeking to learn, to come to understand, asking questions, these are all the pathways through which the conscience is formed and therefore is able to function well. Other questions? Yes?
I want to know more about a mission. What about
Oh,
a generation or two or three that don't have this informed conscience?
Uh-huh.
How guilty are we of omission
Yes,
for
good.
not informing them?
Very good question. All right, so it deals with the nature of sin itself. So remember, sin is a bad human act. What's required for a human act? Knowledge and deliberate choice. So, we talked about this in the second course we had. Ignorance. There are different kinds of ignorance that can undermine fully the voluntary nature of the act. So you're not capable of committing a real human act in the state of certain kinds of ignorance. That's ignorance that you're not culpable for, that you don't even know you're ignorant about. Ignorance that's not something that you've just, ignored possibilities of coming to deeper knowledge. So if a person does not know what they need to know in order to act well, they can still commit an evil act materially, but not something that is a sin if there is no voluntary choice because they don't have sufficient knowledge. Or they might have some degree of knowledge, but not full knowledge, in which case, the degree of their culpability is something that God judges. So we want to distinguish between an evil act, something in itself, a bad object, and the degree of knowledge, full knowledge and deliberate consent that is required to commit certainly a grave sin, but any human act. I have to know what I'm doing and choose what I'm doing. This is why, the first command that Christ gives his apostles is to go teach the nations, go into all the world and teach the good news, so that the saving truth, the truth that people need to know for salvation, they have access to. So our first, even, as laypersons, you have part of this mission as well, part of this prophetic mission in your baptism, to publish the truth, to make known the truth of Christ, to help people to come into contact with the truth so that they can know. So God judges culpability based on a person's degree of knowledge, the degree of ignorance, whether they could have overcome that ignorance if they chose to or not. Some ignorance can't be overcome. I didn't know that I was ignorant or there was a way to overcome it. God judges that degree of culpability. But we want to, for ourselves, those that we have direct responsibility for, and the broader community, help people to come to know as much as possible so there isn't ignorance. Yes?
I wanted to ask about It's kind of related to omission, but I'm not sure. This is mortal sin can be healed by confession.
Yes.
But in the case of those who are not in the church, how can mortal sin be overcome?
Yes. The church does also teach, so confession, we speak about the economy of salvation, the economy that God established by which we are to live and be drawn into full life with Him. In the economy of salvation, the sacraments are the primary way. St. Augustine says it's a very important principle for sacramental theology, that God has bound Himself to the sacraments, meaning God will always work through the sacraments because it's the economy He established. God has bound Himself to the sacraments, but God Himself is not bound by the sacraments. God can work outside of the economy that He has established. And because He is goodness and mercy itself, God can, and we hope does. But He established an economy that He bound Himself to, so that we have the surety of knowing that our sins are forgiven. But the church teaches that mortal sin, for example, say you're a Catholic and you have no access to the sacrament of confession. Maybe you're dying. Mortal sin can be forgiven through perfect contrition. Now, in our normal, ordinary lives as Catholics, we should never, kind of want to take the chance. I've committed a mortal sin and I'm sorry for it. Is my contrition perfect? Well, judging perfect contrition is not something you want to take into your own hands. That's something that God judges. We should take advantage of the avenue, the highway that God has given us to His mercy, which is the sacrament. But mortal sin can be forgiven through perfect contrition. Or within the church who don't have access to the
Right,
sacrament.
and so for those outside the church, right, atheists, people in other cultures, people who are
Yes.
not Christians.
Yes. A lot
And
of
what
that,
is the role of us within the church? Is it our duty to pray for them, right? I mean,
certainly
for their
pray
salvation.
and preach the saving truth so that there are fewer and fewer people who do not know Christ and His salvation. But again, keep in mind that just say you have an atheist and say the person has never had the opportunity, which is, less and less likely in the modern world, but has never had the opportunity to hear the name of Jesus, the message of salvation. They may be guilty of grave matter, but it doesn't mean that they have full knowledge or deliberate consent of what they're doing. The more one knows, the more responsibility one has. To whom more is given, as to us in the body of Christ, more is expected. So an atheist may commit all kinds of grave acts, but it doesn't mean necessarily that they have destroyed the life of that soul. Depending on the knowledge they have, the possibility they've had of hearing the saving message of Christ, etc. So we don't know how God will judge that soul. But okay, friends, well, it's almost 11:50, and I want to give you time to go to Mass if you're interested at noon. But thank you, and if you have further questions, feel free to stay. And next week, we'll finish with considering the causes of sin and then vice and remedies. Thank you. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. God bless you.